Okay. Yeah, please continue.
Well, do you want to set the scene of where we are?
Oh, you can.
I'm not sure I can.
Well, you were saying you're ready to tackle chapter 4, which includes the mathematical framework for describing systems, which uses set theory and graph theory, and graph theory being a sort of a superset of set theory. And then I pointed out that, well, the chapter is really about the language of systems, which includes a mathematical representation, a graphical representation, that is a visual representation, and a natural language representation. And that's so the chapter really covers all of those aspects of it. The reason for the mathematical representation is that that's the basis for a formal description that allows us to first agree on what it is we're talking about. When you talk about a component of a system or a subsystem of a system, having an understanding of what we actually mean by a component is very important. So that's the purpose of the mathematical framework. And then I want to relate all of those various modalities together or with each other so that we can understand how we get a holistic understanding of what a system is and so forth by virtue of having all these modes. And then we can say transmit. We can communicate with one another via these modes as long as we understand what it is those modes contain. So I mentioned about the mathematical framework. Another one is when we're using natural language, we always have this problem of figuring out what our lexicon will be and what the semantics, the lexical semantics are in order to make sure we're sharing the same kind of information. So anyway, that's where chapter 4 is playing
Thank
into.
you. Yeah, that's a great sort of context of what we were chatting about when the recording started. Thank you. And the point that we'd got to in our conversation when Daniel turned on the recording was a specific one that I wanted to pass by you. I'd said I'd been reading a book. I got the author wrong, so I'll correct that. But it's James Franklin and his book on Aristotelian realist philosophy of mathematics. I'll try and put a link in the chat in a minute. But the point that of his that I wanted to bring up was that he talks about Aristotelian maths linking to real world objects of things and numbers of things, 1, 2, 3 things out there, and geometry of things as very basic mathematics before we get into the more abstract mathematics like set theory and graph theory and category theory, and beyond that, well, category theory is even more abstract. So my question really was, in your book, George, on chapter 4 on languaging, was that I've been trying to tussle with, so I wanted to pass it by you, was how the neural brain Franklin talks about units, can't remember his phrase now, self-identifying units out there, which we say that's one thing, there's another thing, there's another thing. And so what I was trying to understand is how the neural brain or consciousness identifies a unit out there that it can begin to count, and then it can begin to have geometry about, that we can begin to describe in, as your chapter 4 you're saying does, natural language. We can have visual aspects of it. We can create sets of elements of things. Um, and I've asked this question of a number of people with a background or interest in neural nets and cognition. And how does the brain start to separate out distinct self objects out there which have a distinct identity? I think that's probably one of the words I'm searching for. So I think Franklin uses one illustration of a picture of a bowl of fruit. And if you've never seen a bowl or fruit before, you might not know what they are. But if you have something, then you know, oh, there's some fruits in that bowl. But for a child, they don't have that context. They learn it. So for the brain of a child, how does it begin to identify that there are independent objects out there, which is the very basic, and which I'm thinking is a very basic aspect of language. You know, natural language has nouns for objects, and then adjectives and descriptions around that. Maths has that as well. You know, sets have members which are elements, which then can be described further, and groups is just sets with relationships around them. Geometry is relationships between things. So that's my question I wanted to pass by you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And Daniel can comment on this as well. The basic idea, and that's why I spent some time talking about boundaries, but you can also couch it in the terminology that Friston uses, which is Markov blanket. Basically, what we're talking about is that as you're perceiving a bunch of patterns, if you will, moving together as one, that's one element of it. So you see some unity in behavior. And then you can also identify foreground versus background. So if you see some kind of a boundary, you can see that it is different from whatever's going on in the background, or perceive that capability. And that, on top of that, this is just my sort of strong belief, if you will, or I could pose it as a hypothesis even, is that there are neural circuits that go back way back in evolutionary time that do all that identifying. They pick out edges, they pick out surfaces, all that kind of stuff. So even something as primitive, say, as an insect, has neural circuits that allow it to identify this shadow is moving differently from this shadow, so these must be different things. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think that the brain has those innate mechanisms for determining that this is something unitary and of itself versus whatever else is going on. That was one of the major considerations when I came up with this ontology structure, that we have object, entity, being one of the primary ontological status.
Yes, that's what I'm getting to in terms of ontological status, like an ontological commitment. One model of neurology that a friend sort of gave me, which seems to make sense, is, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but there are layers of neural nets. And at the bottom layer, for example, might get the sensory data of impressions of things out there in the world. But then the next layer up begins to abstract particular dogs, say, a dog called Fred in the family and a dog called Bark a Lot, and and those are things called dogs. And that higher level of neural net then has the abstraction of these are some entity called Fred and Barkalot. And then we learn maybe at another level above that these are a family of dogs, because everyone describes them as dogs. And then there might be, we learn eventually, and on another level above, that this is part of a family within mammals, and so on like that. So that mechanism, those neural nets work through chemicals and electrical impulses to say, reinforce that there are these objects, and then higher levels of abstraction above that. And that I don't know if that's right, but it kind of like is a working model for me that makes a lot of sense. And it does begin to answer a mechanism for abstraction that, you know, that you were hinting at, the neural circuits, you call them, and mechanisms. So that kind of is my go-to model at the moment for abstraction. It doesn't answer everything, because then the question is like, how does it handle sequences, like one, the first, second, third, fourth, or a sequence in time as in process, or a sequence of go over there to that tree there and then move in that direction towards the hill, you know. So I don't know how neurons handle sequences, but that layering of different neural nets, I don't know if it's true, does seem to handle abstraction.
Yeah, no, that's reasonably good. It's not really, people get a little confused between the way the neocortex works and artificial neural networks, which are in these layers kind of thing. Yeah, you're basically, most of the sensory stuff is going on in the lower and back part of the brain. Say vision is handled in the back part, as far as picking out with topographical fidelity, if you will, the various features that are in the visual field. And then those move forward, those are forwarded to higher level visual centers, which begin to integrate those things. And then at some point, all that information is moving further forward in the brain, where it's being integrated with other things, like what scene is this object in? What are some of the other things going on? And then you get to, you know, what are the relations between these things? I'm not sure, Daniel, I don't know if you know, but I'm not sure how much is actually understood about abstraction as such, or generalization, or gaining tacit knowledge, for example. In terms of where exactly it's happening, I personally think it's a prefrontal cortex function to sort of aggregate all these things together and make sense out of them. Build, that's where the model of the world is being built, so to speak. And then what was the other? That was the neural network.
Sequencing, possibly?
Oh, sequencing, yeah. And by the way, I do talk about all this stuff in the first book. Well, actually, it's in this one as well. Yeah, there's a really interesting work being done on the cerebellum that is not just sequencing, but it's literally encoding programs, you know, steps in complex behaviors and what has to happen next. And that's of the learned stuff. So you get the cerebrum, the motor area of the cerebrum, sort of directing the movements and fine-tuning the movements, but it's the cerebellum that seems to be controlling the sequence of events that take place.
Yeah, a lot of pieces there. I always find it fascinating that there's the abstraction as abstraction. So the concept of Markov blanket, which does no philosophical work. It's just describing a Bayesian graph. So like it makes no claims about society, brain, ant, any of it. And so it doesn't live or die by anything empirical. So totally axiomatic, fully synthetic construct. So that's, and then so that's where system science can also stand. You know, the tuple that you provide for system identification is just a formal, you just modify the equation to make it different.
Yeah.
But it doesn't live or die by any specific equation. And then there's like a totally different mode and status, complementary but separate from anything about the brain. And then the interesting pieces are when features that follow from the model are embodied in the living system. So like the what and the where stream, like you described the whole visual identification from the low level features that you can't unlearn, like edge detection, shadow, light and dark, and like all these things, nested models, like you said, Rob, passing up prediction errors or free energy errors, and then increasing like symbolic and discrete towards the abstract, more continuous and sensory motor on the actual embodied layer. So just those kinds of things which they resonate a lot between the formalism and the body and the brain. And then boundaries, like if you need the total physics or mechanics for a setting, you have the dynamical equation, predator-prey equations, but then also there's the initial conditions and the boundary conditions, and that's kind of like the historiosity and the constraints or the limits. So then when boundaries are centered, then there's just like the dynamics and the history within a fixed, I don't know. But it's not saying things are that way. Just in the math, it's possible to simplify because you already have the structural model of systems, and you just say things are systems, systems interact with systems, principle 1 through 12, they're all in play. Then you might know very little about one or another system or interaction, but it won't be like a surprise that it could happen.
Yeah. When I'm discovering or looking into particular fields of maths, I'm believing or realizing that each one has a very formal definition of a set of axioms, like the male Frankel or the Peano axioms, and then a fixed, and then it's all very constrained. They simplify it down to be a very constrained set of axioms, which isn't general in a general way. It just constrains it to a particular universe then, and then they build up a whole set of rules and notation and guidelines. And it sounds a bit, I'm not fully up to speed with your your fields of active inference and Bayesian and Markov chains, but they sound like very formal universes of structured things which do what they do within their area and decline to go outside of that area. I may be doing it a disservice. It may have implications wider than that, but that's sort of what I'm finding in a lot of the different fields of mathematics, for instance. What Franklin suggests is that the human brain is very good at doing small numbers of things, counting up, 1 to 10 to 20 to 30 and distances. But when you get into the higher abstractions, like huge numbers or even infinity, those are beyond human intuition almost. They have to accept sets of rules about the different definitions of different types of infinity. So yes, I hear what you're saying about the formal theories, and they all have their place because they are a rich deep dive into their particular topic, and they reveal an aspect of truth in a simplified manner. But as a system scientist or general systems theorist, I want to generalize it more to see how far does that apply in a sound way, not on a peripheral or orthogonal way, but on an all-encompassing way. And that's why, coming back to the beginning of this sort of informal conversation about things, is that intuitively we understand objects out there, self-identifying objects out there, but if we want to understand the higher dimensions of abstraction, then we do have to get into rational construction of formal theories. I do accept that.
That's a great point. And one other aspect is like, okay, so developing a measurement tool for what you're measuring, are you searching under the street light where you can look? Oh, you have a meter stick. Now you can measure things that have height. Oh, now you have a scale. So then, the world is made of height. Well, that any measure, so then pulling back, okay, different statistical tools. T-test on health records, didn't make humans into a t-test. PCA on health records didn't. Deep learning on the health records also doesn't. However, that is that line of computer statistics is like merging with real life.
There is an interesting concept, and I found out about the difference between sort of real numbers and natural numbers and irrational numbers, and then the concept was operational closure. Is that can you describe the universe of all numbers with the numbers sets that you have named? And then no, it turns out they needed complex numbers to describe the solution to some, or imaginary numbers, sorry, and then complex numbers to describe the solution to some aspects of reality. And so I think that's an important concept, because we're talking about a set of frames here, or a frame set, an operational closure. Have we got all the points of view that answer all the questions that arise in the universe that we're discussing? And if there's some obvious gaps, then obviously, we need to expand our number of frames to describe that. So I think that's the sort of the meta science that systems brings, is that multiple points of view to say, have we got a complete set of views here? Not just one formal framework or one formal set, but something that answers all the questions that not only that frame set is meant to be answering, but also problems of life and reality, which are much wider and more general than a formal science.
Yeah, a few pieces on that. First, you mentioned your earlier reading group, and there's a relationship with autopoiesis and operational closure, which also traces back to the Kant organism concept of like the end, the teleos of itself, the strange loop for Hofstadter. So multi-scale individuality, and self-identification, and in fact, like it actually material, which has to, can't it has to exist materially through time. So a snowman's going to melt and all of that, or just doesn't exist in mind, at which point it doesn't need to be under some engineering constraints. It's only under cognitive engineering constraints. And then the other point there was, so we're in a space, new discipline or a physical maze or something, and then it's like there's completing that space and that's sort of the fallacy of the reductionist perspective on behavior. You put people in the gambling chair at the lab, it's like, but then there's never like the decision to stop or start or something like that. There's always like a nested decision to be in that, or at least you want there to be from a metacognitive perspective. Like, should you even be in that maze, or should you switch to a different task? Because we could all be doing something different at any given time. So having the two levels at once, which is what necessitates the multi-level architecture that you described earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then having statistics is really helpful, because then we can interface with real data, but then also having the kind of abstraction that can't interface with data is what gives clarity to the whole scheme, and gives the skeleton of the statistical models, which can just be proposed and used, and just empirical.
You threw out a lot of references on operational closure there, which sounded really interesting. I will go over the sound recording, but if you could expand on the coda references in any way. You mentioned Kant, and I think it's Kant, but was it Kant who, well, there were lots of philosophers who suggested that we are inbuilt with concepts of space and time. I think the philosophers, there's a philosophical point of view that these are given a priori almost before people start thinking. And I do wonder how that works back into the neural brain, the consciousness. How do infants and developing neural nets develop that concept of space and time, which is coming back to sub-identifying objects in our consciousness and sequencing that we started this conversation with. So, because space and time do seem a fundamental aspect of bootstrapping up, the consciousness in a new neural network, which is not given in all the formal theories and in AI that we've mentioned. A lot of that's built into the infrastructure and architecture, which is given. But if we're talking about bootstrapping ourselves up from nothing, those all have to be created in some way, or do they? That's what I'm trying to tussle with.
Yeah, it's a really good point, which is like the formal language is just one of the languages in the chapter. Just to make the narrow point, system science is obviously not just broader than any formal system. It's also saying it's broader than, and I think that then that's the question is, so is system science the strange loop? That's like the actual resting point, where you describe systems with systems and then it just kind of closes? Or is that also still just satisficing? I would say whichever one it goes on, whichever way on that, this is a useful direction and a conciliant direction. But those are the like, it's just interesting that, and as people who are interested in systems show, like, the formal is just one component. So it's not just like, well, here's the data structure. It's like, it has to be softer and outside of even the choice to think of it as data. But that's the part that kind of eludes the tuple. But the representation kind of formalizes what's there, but then I don't know. Is that all there is? Like, if you applied that to the cognitive system, is it then a total account? Or does even that?
Well, we're talking about the cognitive, but at the back of our mind is the OODA loop. That the cognitive is just one step in the OODA loop. Or part of few of the steps, you just still need to act on reality, which is one of the anchors back to action and reality. George, you've put a reference in the chat. Do you want to expand on why you put that reference forward?
Yeah, it's just kind of helpful when we're talking about you're interested in where do these concepts come from or how do they get formed and so forth. Susan Carey is one of the foremost researchers in the area of cognitive science with respect to concepts such as numbers and space and time and so forth, and how they're basically there's an innate aspect to most of these, but then our capacity to learn and expand on those fundamental concepts then allows us to take numbers beyond 1, 2, 3, many to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So I found her very useful in that regard. In both books, I really talk about concepts as systems instantiated in neural networks, and how they actually are formed and learned and so forth, at different levels in a hierarchy. So you were mentioning earlier the idea of there being a specific dog. I talk about, and I use dogs as an example. Fido, my specific dog, versus dogs as a class, and then mammals as a class, and so forth, and how those concepts kind of relate to one another and build on one. So there is that nested aspect of these concepts. Before you can really have a concept of a mammal, you've got to have a concept of a dog, of a cat, of a horse, a mouse, and so forth. And then what's similar in all of these different instances. So anyway, that's, you might find that as a helpful reference. And then
I shall put it on my list. The Origin of Concepts, Susan Carey. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, this, whether the capacity is like procedural and finite, procedural and unbounded, instantaneous and unbounded, that's kind of like Penrose. Is math, like, does the human brain mind, like, how does it do math, that kind of area. But at least for what we're discussing as abstractions here, they help you pick up big, so right, no one can think of 1 million ones different things, but 1 million becomes one handled object. So then working memory constraints that are totally reasonable can be used for people who are making very abstract statements about like different types of infinities, because they have it kind of labeled in a super tight way, so they can actually just like pick up these two big clusters and just make the link. That's the pape. So it's like that kind of, and system science is like that area. And so having a common reference type, it's like between the concepts as systems, as Bucky Fuller discussed with geometry of thinking, and of course real material systems in the world that have the energetic persistence and the heat as an inflow and outflow, all of that's done in the book. In Shingai's Bitcoin analysis, there's energy in and heat out, there's information in and information out. So you have for real systems and for cognitive systems. So kind of the actual and the imaginary domains, common approach, proposed draft list of different languages. None of the maps of the territory, none of the cartographies is like the true cartography.
Daniel, you mentioned earlier about the linkage between the mathematical framework that I talk about in the chapter here, and and the mind, the brain, and so forth, and whether that was all there was. I'm actually currently working on something that might shed some light on that. In my book, I part 3 is all about what I call complex, adaptive, and evolvable systems, which is, I think, a much more comprehensive conceptualization of the kind of thing that Beer was trying to get at, and several other people in the past have tried to get at. But really, it's a synthesis involving living systems theory and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we can look at things like the human brain, a human as a system, as a complex, adaptive, and evolvable system, and that it can learn, a human being can learn totally new structures in the brain, and those totally new structures give rise to new behaviors. Pardon me. So I'm working on trying to elaborate that more in more detail than in the book, because there I'm giving a very general view of this complex systems. And now what I want to do is tie it very specifically to cognition and ultimately to consciousness. So I don't know what's going to come out of it, but that's kind of where I'm going right now.
Are you working on a new book, George?
Well, I'm not making any promises. At my age, I can't claim I'm going to be around long enough to complete a book of that nature. But I will. What I will do is I've got several people who I'll leave notes and say, in the event of my demise, send these files to, and so you guys can do with it as you wish. but yeah, I'm doing it in that framework, not a textbook like the other guys. This is going to be more of a general readership.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me think about the cognitive science, the cognitive turn, uh, and so the kind of the inquisitiveness of science turning onto humans, extended, embedded, all these features that get brought in that are just like just like common sense, like obvious things. Oh, proximity matters. Oh, connections are sparse. Just like, and then the kind of systems and humanism, and then all the different complex flavors of humanism that system thinkers in the past have kind of thought about. Because without understanding the experimenter, like the observer, I mean, the experiment is just, there's no experiment. It can't be even, it doesn't even happen. So understanding our active role, like in the knowledge engineering system and the education system, like understanding human as a system, a part of systems has to be part of it. That's just like, that's the kind of interesting part of it, or related to it being a meta discipline. Cognitive science almost being a meta discipline. Or how do you see the relationship between cognitive science and system science, George?
Well, probably expanding a little bit on cognitive science. I I think we have to admit non-conscious processing. Well, first of all, let me state I do see a relationship between computation as we understand it, say in the digital world, and computation in the neural world. And I think a lot of people are expressing that same view, that we're talking about information processing, so that is computation. So whatever the medium is, it's we have to well, once we understand what information actually is and not try to make it be something that it's not. I have this ongoing complaint that people use the word information when they mean knowledge. But anyway, once we do that, then it's possible to look at how the brain is processing these concepts, how it learns, how it does all of this kind of stuff, and treat it as one of these complex, adaptive, and evolvable systems. So once we understand, by the way, that's what I call an archetype model. That is to say, these are all the components that need to be in any complex, adaptive, and evolvable system. They're going to be in different forms, and you're going to find them in different places and different relations and so forth, but they're there. So if you're doing an analysis of something like brain, you would actually have this model to guide you to look for these specific things. As an example, the model includes a governance architecture that includes a strategic management function. And now we're coming finally to understand the prefrontal cortex, and specifically, or more specifically, the frontal polar area as being that organizer of strategic manipulation of concepts that we already have, or the models that we already have, and conducting these what if in the distant future such and such happens, what should we do, kind of those strategic kinds of questions. So I think that that's to me, it's a kind of a straightforward relationship that what we see as cognition in the human brain is a result of system evolution. And I don't think there's much more that can be said other than look at the details.
Yeah, a lot there.
I think I'd have a slightly different viewpoint.
Please.
I think if I'm understanding your question or comparison between cognitive science and system sciences correctly, the system sciences for me, as coming from a general system theory point of view, are more of an ontological question, with science, system science as a meta science or an approach, a scientific approach to whatever this general systems theory is. But the cognitive science I would class more as an epistemological viewpoint, and only one of the frames. We talked earlier about operational closure. Certainly, the cognitive sciences are an important viewpoint, obviously from a human point of view or conscious point of view, but for operational closure, they're not the only or the most significant. You need other frames to complete the question of what it means for the conscious mind as well. So I see it as cognitive science as just one of the frames that system science would bring to bear on understanding the system of interest, the system.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I do make the argument that system science is both ontological or ontology and epistemology. whereas, yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. What I started out saying though was if we expand cognitive science to include what exists, like concepts, for example, what is the ontological status of concepts, and or the hierarchy of concepts and so forth. So I don't think we, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting how like the implicit and explicit disciplinary commitments, like well, that's psychology or something. I mean, though we see, of course, crossing and everything like that, but just that there's always a give and take with what the field sets out to account for, what any scientist realistically feels like their experiments are going to show, and just kind of offer these more local experiments and just kind of toss them up. And then there's like, then there's all the kind of interpretive layer, but then it's hard. But any kind of other thoughts? Otherwise, just fun, random topics.
No, uh, I did have a thought earlier, and like usually happens, it's gone. So I guess I'll let it go at that.
I did have a thought from earlier as well, which I wrote down, luckily. I know my mind. And Franklin talks about the natural sciences and then the social sciences. But he groups together a lot of the sciences that are of interest to us around mathematics and complexity and information science and so on. And he calls those the formal sciences. And I don't know if he means, I haven't yet bottomed out whether he means formal as in what we were talking about earlier in a formal structure and set, or formal as in forming something based around information. But that was new to me, the grouping of a number of systems, I would arguably call system sciences as formal sciences. Have you heard that grouping phrase used at all?
The only thought I had was formal science would include, mathematical, using mathematics to formalize the scientific concepts.
Yeah, I would hear formal as including math that's beyond the quantitative. So not just statistical formal, but logic, category theory, formal, but not quantitative or numerical. And then also just in that sort of a form double play, information. I mean, I'll copy this here. My colleague sent me this book, Homo Sacer, by Agamben, and it's all about this Roman concept of the Homo Sacer and all this other terms discussed another time. But like, what I found interesting about the style is a huge amount of the rhetoric is purely linguistic. It's just like it's in reference to words, and like it makes all the difference how you interpret formal, one or the other, both of those definitions. It's the ultimate question in the space of identifying concepts. So then how the word and how sacred had a kind of ambivalence in ancient times, but then sacred has like a pretty much positive, holy definition in our times, but like there was an ambivalence, but then what happened to that? And it's very complex and very interesting.
Paste that one up as well.
Yeah, oh yeah.
There's Martin Zwick is presenting. I think he's one of your book series authors, isn't he, on
Right.
elements and relations?
Right.
I think he's presenting to the ISSS in November.
I believe so. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah,
I
he
look
will
forward
be
to that.
presenting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did think of what it was I was going to say, but we can take it up another time. I was getting back, Rob, to the kind of math and formalism that I've been using with set theory and so forth. And just has to do with the fact that choosing to represent things using set theory and sets is closer to natural, what we naturally experience. If I have 20 marbles, I've got a set of marbles. There are 20 of them in there, and they're all different and so forth. So there are a lot of natural world, natural language aspects of set theory, not dealing with the operations on sets, but rather with the nature of sets themselves.
Yeah.
And we don't have to get into paradoxes or anything of that nature. So sometime we can maybe take
Yeah. Great point. Great topic. All right. Thank you, fellows. Farewell.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thank you all.